So lately, there's been all this hype about virtual tourism as the new thing. And anyone with even the slightest bit of discernment should be able to see between the lines here. Now, there have been all these articles lately, some promoting it, others more critical of it, but there's been a lot of talk about virtual tourism. So, what is virtual tourism? Basically, it's this idea that like using a computer or using VR or whatever, you can supposedly like look at these places as if you're there, kind of like almost like a hologram or whatever, or a video game, but a more tourism centric one. Now, it's pretty obvious to me that all this talk about virtual tourism is really the elite's way of sticking your face in shit and telling you to eat it up. It's obvious that they do not like the masses traveling places. The elites want to have these places all to themselves, and they want you to be happy strapped into a VR chair with this shitty virtual tourism simulation. And to say that it's a substitute for actually going somewhere is complete bullshit. It's like saying that masturbation is a substitute for sex. In fact, virtual tourism is to tourism what masturbation is to sex. It's what porn is to sex. That's what virtual tourism is. It's what a McDonald's hamburger is to like a really, really, really good hamburger. It's just an inferior substitute. It's what Coldplay is to Radiohead. No, I'm kidding. I actually do like some of Coldplay's stuff, but basically it's an inferior substitute, and we all know it. It's like the that meme, the "we have X at home" meme. X at home, you know, that meme with the mom saying, "Oh, we have that at home. We have virtual tourism at home. We have Venice at home. We have the Grand Canyon at home. We have Banff National Park at home. We have Prague at home." No, you don't. It's not a real substitute, and it's never going to be. Everybody knows that some simulated experience is never going to be a substitute for the real thing. You're never going to be able to capture the feeling of being in a place, of seeing the local people, of feeling the air, feeling the temperature, the sights, hearing the sounds, smelling what it smells like there. Are they going to be able to capture the feeling of what it smells like being in like a pine forest in the mountains? I don't think so. Are they going to capture the physical feeling of it, the strenuousness of a hike, but the reward that you feel from having given yourself such a workout in such a beautiful place? No, they're not going to capture any of that shit. Seriously, The Matrix was meant to be a warning, not an instruction manual. Honestly, anybody who thinks that this is a substitute for the real thing is lying. And another thing that really pisses me off about these articles, they're saying, well, virtual tourism will be an alternative for people who are too poor to actually travel. What they mean by that actually is, we're going to make it unaffordable for the middle class to travel, so this will be their alternative. The only people who will be able to travel now are the upper class, the elite. But for the rest of you, well, maybe you'll be able to travel locally, but you won't be able to go any further than that. So here's your virtual tourism, you fucking Goyim peasants, you pieces of shit. Go and fucking eat the shit, you disgusting peasants. They want all these beautiful places to be playgrounds for the rich. They do not like the democratization of tourism. They do not like average people traveling at all. They want to go to Lake Louise and see nothing but rich people there. They want to go to Venice or to the French Riviera or the Amalfi Coast and see nothing but rich people there. They do not want to see the filthy commoners in these places. They want to go to the Grand Canyon and see nothing but rich people there. They do not want these filthy fucking commoners polluting their elite destinations. Oh no, these beauties should not be for the Goyim. Beauty should not be for the peasants. Beauty should only be for the elite. The peasants can live in their fucking hideous suburbs strapped to their fucking VR, and they can eat fucking bugs and they can eat shit. Let them eat shit. Let them eat bugs and let them eat shit and let them be strapped into a VR chair like in a fucking pod of goo hooked up to the fucking Matrix. Let the peasants eat shit. That is basically what they're saying with this VR tourism crap. And yes, I do think the environment is important, but I think it's bullshit. I think if they really cared about the environment, they'd be doing something about the SUV problem. They'd be doing something about the sprawl problem, but they're not doing shit about those problems. Those problems are only getting worse over time. And there's a lot of solutions that they're ignoring. They're ignoring nuclear power. They're ignoring the fact that there's cleaner jet fuels. You can make tourism a lot more sustainable if you used cleaner jet fuels. But no, they don't do these things. Also, how about build more trains? Build more trains so you don't have to fly if you're within the same continent. And give people more vacation time so they have more time to travel in ways that are more sustainable, like take a train rather than flying. You know, if you only have only 2 weeks vacation time, you're going to spend your whole fucking vacation getting there and back if you're taking the train. Of course, everybody's going to want to fly. But this isn't just coming from the top down. There is also a bottom up side to it, which is very interesting. There's a certain segment of the public that is really happy to see mass tourism destroyed. And why is that? In some cases, I think these people view themselves as like aspirational elites. They empathize with the elites even though they aren't one themselves. But in other cases, I think it's jealousy. I think it's like often, frankly, people who are poor or at the lower end of the middle class, and they resent the people slightly higher on the economic ladder than them. And it's all about sticking it to those people, to the middle class, or maybe the upper middle class to an extent, even sticking it to the lower middle class to a degree. It's partly that envy, but to that I say, you know, why are you hating the people slightly above you on the ladder instead of hating the people at the very top? And the people at the very top are the ones who are behind all these policies and the ones who are the most supportive of it. They are the ones who want to kill mass tourism more than anyone else because these rich fuckers want these places all to themselves. So it's like, rather than hating the person slightly above you, why don't you hate the people at the top? It's like that one comic that I like. It says, hey, that guy's covered in less shit than we are. And then the guy says, hey, maybe the problem is that we're all covered in shit. I think that's really partly what's happening here. Like, basically envy toward the middle class from the lower classes, or to the slightly higher members of the middle class by the slightly lower members of the middle class. But that's not the whole thing, okay? That's not the entire thing, because to make travel into a class issue isn't entirely true, because there are some poor people who travel a lot because they save up for it and because they don't spend a whole bunch on other things. And that's the problem, I think, is a lot of people can't afford to travel because they spend so much money on other shit, often shit that they don't need, like expensive vehicles, gigantic houses, and like having like 4 or 5 pets. Like, do you really need all this? Clothes is another huge thing. People spend a lot of money on video games, weed, alcohol. But I think the two biggest are big cars, like expensive vehicles, and bigger homes, more expensive homes than you need. I think those are the two biggest things that people waste money on. And that's another thing. I think that, I mean, in order to travel, not every vacation needs to be super expensive. Unfortunately, COVID has made traveling more expensive because, at least in my case, there was one trip I took that was way more expensive than it would have been otherwise because we had to fly to the US and then rent a car. It would have been so much cheaper if we could have just driven to the US directly, but we weren't allowed to at the time. And we needed a car for that trip because it was in the national parks. Like, that's one thing. I do talk about public transit, but realistically, I don't think national parks can ever be totally transit dependent. There's no fucking way you're going to convince me that, like, oh, you can hike down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and then rely on a bus to take you back to your hotel. No. I mean, it's simply not viable to rely on public transit out in the national parks. But anyway, I digress. My point is, yeah, okay, traveling has become more expensive because of these stupid COVID regulations, and I think that's the intention, to price out the poors, or even the lower middle class, or even the middle class. And I don't think it needs to be this expensive. I think a lot of this is just artificial shit due to the COVID laws. But I also think, to be fair, there are ways you can save money when traveling. For instance, there's no need to stay at super expensive hotels. Before COVID, I would have recommended staying at hostels, but now I think hostels are unfortunately a COVID trap. There's no way you're not going to get COVID at hostels. Like, I've gotten sick twice at hostels, but that was before COVID. It was just a cold or maybe in one case the flu, but whatever. It's not that big a deal. But with COVID, if you get COVID, it's like, oh, you're not going anywhere. They're going to legally bar you from like leaving the room where you're staying or whatever. And plus, you'll probably be pretty fucked up too. So I can't really, in good conscience, recommend hostels right now. But I will say, if you want to save money on traveling, cheaper hotels is often a good idea. Are often a good idea. Try to drive if you can, rather than renting a car, if possible, or take a train. That's a great way too, especially in Europe. There's no need to really use a car for most places in Europe. You can usually take either the train or the bus to get there. Another huge way to save money is simply, if there's a place you want to go that's on the opposite side of the world, see if there's somewhere closer by where you can go. And it's a way to pollute less too. You know, if they're talking about travel being environmentally unfriendly, obviously the further you go, the more you pollute. That's just basic facts. So it's like, I do see some people, it's like they want to go to Australia. They live in North America and they want to go to Australia to see the red rock formations, but it's like they haven't seen the red rock formations in the Southwest United States, which are much closer. It's like, don't you at least want to see the ones that are closer before you see the ones that are further? Same with like mountains. It's like they want to go to the mountains in New Zealand, but they haven't explored the Canadian or American Rocky Mountains or the Pacific coastal ranges. You know, it's like, I kind of get maybe New Zealand has less of an issue with forest fires than we do, but even then it's like, I think if you go in July, you can often avoid the forest fires. They're the worst in August and September, I believe. There is that, but at the same time, I do feel like some people, like, they go out of their way to travel to places that are as far away as possible. It's like, do you really need to go as far away as possible? That's a legitimate criticism of travelers that I think that is a legitimate criticism. Some people go unnecessarily far. Like, I've only ever really traveled within Canada, the US, and Europe, and a tiny bit in Latin America. I've never been to Africa. I've never been to Asia. I've never been to Australia or New Zealand. And there's this website I look up. It's like distance.to. It shows how far it is from one place to another. And generally speaking, I try to keep my trips within a certain radius, like 9,000 kilometers or whatever, which is basically like half of the globe. But still, it's my half of the globe, and it's polluting a lot less than if I went to literally the opposite end of the world. So I think that's a strategy. Like, I mean, I can't really say like stay in your own continent, because there's a lot of amazing things that are in Europe that aren't in North America. There's a lot of amazing things in North America that aren't in Europe. But like, I do question, like, do people really need to go to the opposite end of the world? I guess the only exception would be if you live in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa or South America, like somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere. I could understand more the need to go to the opposite end of the world there, because your end of the world is kind of this, like, basically this extremity. But if you're in Europe or North America, I don't think you need to really go to the opposite end of the world to have a good trip. Another thing is, okay, so where does this opposition to tourism come from? I think a lot of it is, as I've said, like, people who are serotonin driven and who see those who are dopamine driven as being sinful or disgusting. It's really one of those horseshoe theory things where I find there's like a certain like puritanism that exists among both the left and the right, among serotonin driven people. And those types of people, they really don't like traveling. They see it as frivolous. They see like wanting to see beautiful things. They see it as frivolous and hedonistic. But yet these same people will defend like living in an unnecessarily huge home, LARPing as a farmer in the suburbs, being like, oh, I need this massive yard, even though you don't do anything with it. or having this massive polluting vehicle. They see that as good because they believe like prizing experiences over things is frivolous and hedonistic, and you should prize things over experiences, even if those things are just unnecessarily huge and expensive and wasteful. So I think there is a certain divide going on there along those lines too, where they really just hate travelers and they really just want to put an end to mass tourism because their brains are simply wired a different way, and they don't understand why certain people seek out beautiful surroundings and beautiful places to go. And again, I'm not saying all tourists go to places to see places that are beautiful. Like that's what I do. I go to like nature. I go to natural places, historic places, places that are beautiful that have a certain meaning to me. But not everybody does that. You know, some people like to lie around on a beach. Some people like to gamble at casinos. You know, some people like to go on sex trips. I mean, people do have different reasons for traveling, and I'm not saying all those reasons for traveling are good or commendable. But at the same time, I do think that there is a certain, I don't know, a certain attitude among some people, like homebody type people, serotonin driven people, where they're very like, they see the pursuit of beauty as hedonistic, and they see it as like a sin to crave beauty too much. And I don't like that. I don't like their attitude. I don't think it's a good thing for the world. But I do think that that is part of the motivation for like the anti-tourism sentiment among many of the masses. It's the same people who largely support the COVID lockdown because they think it like, oh, it teaches you what really matters in life. It brings people back to the basics, what matters, home and family, blah, blah, blah. Travel doesn't matter. Going to beautiful places doesn't matter. Only home and family matter. Like that kind of thing that people will say. Like, it's like, I think that's part of the motivation too. But I think by and large, it is the elites that are behind this. There is some bottom-up support for destroying mass tourism, but I think ultimately the elites are the ones who are primarily behind it. And I think they use the environment as a smokescreen. There are legitimate environmental issues with tourism, but I think those issues could be solved without destroying mass tourism entirely. Maybe, for instance, tax certain flights more if they're really long flights. Make it easier for people to take longer trips so that they can travel in ways that are more sustainable, like by train. There's some fund cleaner jet fuels, you know, subsidize that. There's a lot of ways that they could be making tourism more environmentally sustainable, but they're not doing it. They're just saying, oh no, you can't travel anymore, Goyam. You can't travel anymore, peasants. But they're not saying that about SUVs. They're not saying you can't have an SUV anymore. They're not saying that you can't live in a massive McMansion anymore, or even your typical size suburban home, which is pretty fucking wasteful and extravagant on its own. They're not saying that. There's the whole live in a pod thing isn't happening, but they are saying travel in a pod. You can live in a large suburban home, but you still have to travel hooked up to your VR shit. So live in a big house, drive a big house, travel in a fucking pod. That's the way of the future, apparently.